This week, we launch our own podcast. You can listen to it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering stories from around the world, similar to those you see on this program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just out for a run, give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search online for CGTN and the Heat podcast. After major elections for the European Parliament across Europe, who are the winners and the losers? And what about the UK as the race to succeed Prime Minister Theresa May ramps up? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Voters in all 28 EU member states have taken part in elections that may determine the future direction of Europe. Voter turnout was the highest in 20 years. The centrist blocs in the European Parliament lost their majority as they tried to hold off a rise in Eurosceptic and nationalist movements. Meanwhile, European Liberals won more than 100 seats.
So for the first time in 40 years, since the first elections in 1979 of the European Parliament, the two classical parties, Socialists and Conservatives, will no longer have a majority.
In France, Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party did well, winning a narrow victory over French President Emmanuel Macron's party. In Italy, a big winner was Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini, the leader of Italy's right-wing League Party, who claims Europe is changing.
I'm happy because for the first time in the history of European Parliament elections, the Italian votes could change the history of Europe.
But pro-EU parties are still likely to remain in control of the European Parliament by putting together new alliances, and they have signalled a strong pushback against extremists and those critical of the European project.
One message is crystal clear. We will not work together with those who don't believe in Europe, with those who want to destroy Europe.
And from Germany to Ireland, Green parties demanding more action on climate change made big gains in what's been called a green wave. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, voters strongly supported the newly formed Brexit party that wants to take Britain out of the EU.
Never before in British politics has a new party launched just 6 weeks ago topped the polls in a national election. The reason, of course, is very obvious. We voted to leave in a referendum. We were supposed to do so on March the 29th, and we haven't.
Meanwhile, just days after British Prime Minister Theresa May announced that she's stepping down in early June, the race to succeed her is taking shape. The former mayor of London and British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson is an early front-runner for the job. There is much to discuss, so let's get to our panel. Joining me now from Oxford is Helen Thomas. She is the CEO and founder of Blonde Money. She provides financial and political analysis. Also joining us from London is Sean O'Grady. He is associate editor with the Independent newspaper. With me here in the studio is Suzanne Lynch. She is Washington correspondent for the Irish Times. And joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina, is Klaus Larres. He's a professor of international affairs at the University of North Carolina. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Suzanne, let's start here in the studio. Let's look at this election and how some of these blocs did. The European far-right and Eurosceptic parties, those are parties who are not enthusiastic about the European Union, they were expected to make gains in this election. They did, but only modestly. So what did you make of the outcome?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of ways to spin this because it's a bit for everybody in these results. But I think on balance, this was a good day for Brussels and for those who believe in the European Union project. Yes, as you say, the kind of far-right parties and populist parties that are anti-EU did make gains, but not as much as they may have hoped. And even there, just in the opening package, yes, the two main parties, the EPP and the SND, did lose ground, but that doesn't really reflect what's really happening because you have a third wing, if you like, the Liberal group, which counts Emmanuel Macron and his party among its members. They made big gains. So altogether, that kind of coalition of the big groups who are pro-EU and who are passionate about the EU project, they are still, it will have a majority. So from that point of view, I think Brussels can kind of breathe a sigh of relief. Also positive is the fact that the turnout was very high. And some people might put that down to Brexit. One of the unintended consequences, perhaps, of Brexit, that it made people in the rest of the EU kind of realise what they have. Maybe perhaps it has galvanised support behind the EU project, or at least enthusiasm. But yeah, I think the EU, as I say, pro-EU people can be glad what happens. Now, it does mean that we're going to have an awful lot of horse trading. It'll be, we've got a lot of big parties and big personalities now. So the next big job for the European Union will be to decide who gets the big jobs, who's going to become the next European Commission president, and also jobs like the European Central Bank president, hugely important role. That's all going to be debated this week when EU leaders gather in Brussels.
Sean O'Grady, there's been a lot of attention focused on the vote in France as well as Italy. Marine Le Pen and her party did a lot in France, so did the deputy Italian Prime Minister Matteo Salvini and his League party in Italy. What kind of a challenge are they going to pose in Parliament, and what kind of a challenge are they going to pose to the governance of Europe?
Well, they'll pose as big a challenge as they possibly can, because they don't like the way Europe is run. There's a difference between the ones in Italy and some of the other countries, Poland and Hungary, that are not proposing to take their countries out of the European Union, like the Brexit Party is in Britain, who did very well. But nonetheless, what they will be up to is seeking to disintegrate the European Union, to make it a looser confederation of nations, rather than a rather centralizing bureaucracy and body as it is today. So that is what they will be doing. They won't be so destructive, I think, and they haven't got the numbers quite to do that, but they will make their influence known, and they will make their views clear, and they will be working across countries as well. They will do that, despite the fact that they're all nationalists, which is a slight contradiction in terms. But anyway, they will be acting in that way to try and loosen the grip of the European institutions and make them weaker.
Helen Thomas, the big winner in the United Kingdom was the anti-European Brexit Party, led by Nigel Farage, whom we heard earlier on in the programme. The success of the Brexit Party, did that surprise you?
No.
Not really, no.
We've seen this coming.
I'll get to you in a moment, Sean. Helen,
sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead, Helen.
Yeah, of course. So, no, it wasn't a surprise, as Sean was suggesting there. It has been coming for a while. They were polling very strongly and have been since that Brexit Party was formed. And really, should be no surprise, as even Nigel Farage said there in that clip you ran with his victory speech, it's pretty clear why they're getting such a good backing, which is for the number of people who did vote to leave. Of course, we haven't actually left yet. And these elections were a real touch paper for that, because, of course, they were the ones that the UK wasn't supposed to be taking part in 3 years after we had a referendum where we voted to leave. So it's not really a surprise. The question now, of course, is what the Brexit Party will do next.
Sean, you wanted to say something about the Brexit Party's performance?
Well, yes. I mean, it wasn't a surprise. It was what happened in the elections was almost a rerun of the referendum we had in 2016, actually, although a lot of people have been campaigning for a real referendum. In the European elections, you found that about 40%, 35 to 40% of the country voted for anti-EU, pro-Brexit parties, and about the same proportion for Remain parties, pro-European parties. So there's a bit of a deadlock there. And I think it's not a question of what the Brexit Party will do next. I think it's a question of what the Conservative Party will do next, in particular the governing party, which got 9% of the vote. I don't know if anyone can imagine the equivalent in other countries, but it was an extraordinarily poor performance, the lowest in modern democratic history in Britain. No country, no major parties had as bad a fall as the Conservatives. If they carry on like this, they'll be extinct within 5 or 10 years. That may be overstating matters, but it was a very, very bad period of election for them. And so what they have to do is decide what they're going to do about that. And what they say they're going to do is take on the Brexit agenda and advocate the possibility of what they call a no-deal Brexit, a hard Brexit, getting out of the European Union as quickly and cleanly as they would have it as possible, but it'd be very disruptive indeed. So that's the real question about how the Conservative Party react to this absolute drubbing that they've had, as I say, quite unprecedented.
Klaus Larres, what is your assessment of these elections? Do you think the centrist parties did well enough to hold off those parties that are very critical of the European Union?
Yeah, on the whole, I think it was a good result for Brussels. You know, it was expected that the far right would increase its vote significantly more. They only increased their vote from something like 20% 5 years ago to 25%. That is only a modest increase, while the centrist parties, the socialists, the conservatives now need coalition partners to have a majority in parliament. That is the democratic game. That is in countries such as Germany or France, what normally is the case anyway. So I think on the whole, these elections were quite positive for Europe, and 51% of the voters in Europe participated. And above, that's 8% more than 5 years ago. And above all, Europe counts again. You know, a few years ago, 10 years ago, who talked about European elections? That was something regarded as a protest vote. No one really bothered and cared about it. And today, everyone is talking about it. And I think that is a good result for the process of European integration.
Suzanne, another big winner in these elections, the Green Party. We saw what's been called the Green Wave from Ireland to Germany. Was that expected?
Yeah, Ireland is a good microcosm, I think, of what happened across Europe. Not in all countries, more in the western part of Europe. But we did see a really great performance by Green parties across this western half of Europe, as I said. So in Ireland, the Green Party did much, much better than expected. And really, it seems to have hived off votes from the ruling, the largest party at the moment in Ireland, Fine Gael, that's Taoiseach Leo Varadkar's party. It seems to have taken some of their votes. So it's significant, but what it does raise a question, and this is the same question that everyone needs to face, is this just an anomaly? You know, European elections are different elections than national elections. So this is an election where maybe people flirt with another party. They feel they can kind of vote for someone and express their dissatisfaction with the ruling party. But when it actually comes down to a national election, are they going to be willing to vote for those kind of alternative parties? So that remains to be seen. But it does, I think, genuinely reflect a kind of a real resurgence of the climate change issue. And why that is important is that in Brussels, I mean, as a lot of people would say, sometimes in the European Union, the European Parliament does not get to control much in terms of legislation. In terms of climate change, it does. And it really does affect, you know, how national governments, their climate, their emission targets, you know, rules over fuel. So having a huge green presence in the European Parliament, I think, is really going to dictate a change in EU policy when it comes to climate change.
And under the system, national governments, rather, would be obliged to follow the...
Yeah, depending on which rules, but in a lot of them they do. I mean, Ireland, for example, is facing fines for, you know, over emitting, for example. So there's really quite strict rules on climate change, things like plastic bag, you know, plastics, that kind of thing. I think we're going to see a lot of legislation in that field, and I think the Green Party are going to sway that. They may not be looking for the top jobs in the European Parliament, but I think they're going to want to affect change when it comes to policy.
Sean O'Grady, we were talking about Nigel Farage a moment ago, and he seems to believe that his party's success may not just stop right here. We've seen the collapse of the two dominant United Kingdom parties, the Conservatives and the Labour Party, in these elections. This is what Farage had to say, and in fact, in a sense, he's been calling for a general election. Let's watch this.
If we don't leave on October the 31st, then the scores for the Brexit party today will be repeated in a general election, and we are getting ready for it. Thank you.
So he says in a general election, but do you believe Farage has, and his party, do they have the momentum to carry into a general election in the United Kingdom?
Possibly, yes. You couldn't rule it out because we've seen extraordinary things in the last few years in British general elections. Extraordinary things indeed. I mean, a couple of years ago we had an election, Theresa May and the Conservatives were supposed to get a gigantic landslide, and they lost their majority, and the Labour Party, under the most left-wing leader since the Second World War, did extraordinarily well and took their majority off them. So these are strange times. I think the general assumption, according to the polling, is that the Brexit vote, which is about 30% of the British vote at the moment in these European elections, that would subside quite a bit down to about, say, 12 or 15% or 16% or something of that order. Now, that would be quite a big challenge to the Conservative Party, and it might well mean that there would be some UKIP MPs coming into Westminster if they were carrying on like that, and it might mean that the Conservatives were inclined to give them a bit of an electoral pact or something like that, or do some sort of deal with them if they carry on with this sort of strength. So it will make some difference. But the irony would be in the Westminster system, where I'm sitting, is that if the Brexit Party takes more votes away from the Conservative Party, which is also a Brexit party, although a softer Brexit party, the Conservatives will go down. The Brexit Party won't pick up that many seats, in fact. And what will happen is that the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, which is another party which is pro-Remain, will pick up. And so you'll have this extraordinary situation in which the anti-European party takes votes and seats away from the other anti-European party and leaves the more pro-European parties to form a government. So this is a crazy world that we live in, because we don't have a proportional system of voting. Things can happen by accident. There are big trends and big movements. So Nigel Farage, we could have anything from Nigel Farage virtually disappearing to him becoming, well, I wouldn't say Prime Minister exactly, but maybe a kingmaker in Parliament in the future. And it all depends on what happens with Brexit to some extent. It happens what happens with the economy, what happens for our new Prime Minister, whoever that's going to be, and what they're going to do with politics, and what they're going to do with the government, and what they're going to do with Brexit. Now, all those things are unpredictable, still unpredictable.
Helen Thomas, we now have this very bizarre situation, of course, where the Brexit MEPs will be taking their seats in the European Parliament. It's such an anomaly when you look at it. But what can we expect from the Brexit Party in the European Parliament? I mean, could they cause chaos there?
So yes, they have emerged completely ironically as the joint biggest party represented in the European Parliament. They're had the same number of MEP seats as Angela Merkel's CDU-CSU, which is quite astonishing, of course, when, yes, they want Britain to come out of the European Union altogether. In terms of what they can actually do, I think it was your guest in the studio who pointed out that there's a lot of horse trading that goes on, there's a lot of groupings that happen at the European Parliament level. Even though we're talking about the demise of those two major centrist groupings of the EPP and the S&D, they still have hundreds of seats. You know, the Brexit Party is just 29. So, yes, they can do some damage, but I think it will be more about what that says to Europe about how it should negotiate with Britain in the next 6 months. And, of course, when we get to the next deadline, will they grant another extension, having seen how Britain now apparently feels towards the European Union?
Klaus Larres, what about the far right in Germany and in other parts of Europe as well, Eastern Europe particularly? Do you think they would have a lot of influence on key policy issues like immigration, for example?
Yeah. Can I just cut back to the British situation, which was mentioned before? I think, you know, both major party, Labour and the Conservatives, are desperate to avoid a general election in Britain. When you look at the result, disastrous for both major parties, you know, no one can be interested to have general elections that have even a similar result or even perhaps a worse result regarding Labour. So I think what may happen with a new Conservative leader is that he tries to resolve the situation as it is. And I think whoever is the new Conservative leader and Prime Minister may want to revisit the backstop and the Irish question, because that is what has held up the Brexit ratification in the British Parliament. If there is some agreement on what to do about the backstop and perhaps accept the backstop as it is, with a customs union potentially for Northern Ireland, but not for the rest of the UK, which would of course drive a wedge between Northern Ireland and the UK, and which is anathema to most British MPs so far. But if that can be resolved, then I can see that Theresa May's withdrawal bill and her agreement she negotiated with the EU can actually be gotten through Parliament by the new Conservative Prime Minister. And the new Conservative Prime Minister might be more of a realist and perhaps care less about the Irish question and the backstop than Theresa May did. Because after all, in 10 or 15 years' time, Northern Ireland might be unified with Ireland anyway. The demographic development goes that way. So why spend an awful lot of energy and the potential failure of Brexit for good on the Northern Irish question? Why not just accept it, that there can be a different formula for Northern Ireland and the UK, and then go ahead with Brexit? Because I think the new leader might have the courage to actually attempt to do that.
Do you agree, Suzanne, very quickly?
Well, look, I think you're absolutely right that the Irish question is going to re-emerge the closer we get to October 31st, the new deadline. I think there's a lot of concern this weekend in Dublin about what's happened. They believe that the most likely outcome will be the person who succeeds Theresa May will be more of a hard Brexiteer who will want that divide from Europe. That is not what Dublin wants. So, I mean, one of the problems, of course, for Theresa May, the key issue was that she is being supported in her government by the DUP. That's the more hardline unionist party in Northern Ireland who have said, no, they don't want to be treated differently in the UK. It has to be said in certain areas, because in a lot of other areas, for example, abortion, gay rights, they have a completely different regime than the rest of the UK. But they still have that problem. The arithmetic is still the same unless there is a general election. And if there was a general election with a different arithmetic and the DUP maybe did not have as much power, there could be something different. So I think one of the questions is, will we have a general election? Jeremy Corbyn was calling for example, today.
Lots of moving parts.
Second referendum.
Yeah.
We could have a second referendum, yeah.
Helen, the other big political story in the United Kingdom, we've been talking about this in a way, is the resignation of Prime Minister Theresa May, her decision to step down. This was her announcement outside number 10 Downing Street last Friday.
I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold. The second female Prime Minister, but certainly not the last. I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
So, Helen, how does Theresa May's departure impact Brexit?
Well, quite significantly, as we've been discussing, it's what direction does the new leader of the Conservative Party try to take those Brexit negotiations? And what we're eventually ending up with here is an increasingly polarised electorate and a very polarised parliament. And within parliament, within parties, there are schisms, there are breaks and divisions. And it was always going to be very difficult for anyone, even a skilled leader with a big majority, to have got something done. And of course now, you know, there's no majority, and who is this next leader going to be? Now, of course, the front runner who has been mentioned earlier on in your piece is the former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. He is considered to be a hard Brexiteer, but I would say he did vote for Theresa May's deal in the end. And he has recently been trying to slightly massage his comments by saying something like nobody rational would force a no deal, but nobody sensible would take it off the table either, which is, you know, slightly trying to have it both ways. He's a very clever man. That's what he tries to do. But we do need a salesman. We need a salesman to sell this to Parliament and then to sell it to the country. And the question is whether Boris, or indeed whoever wins this race, is able to do that.
Sean O'Grady, what are your views on that? You know, the good money right now is that Boris Johnson will probably be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But as Helen points out, he is a hard Brexiteer, but did vote for Theresa May's deal, nevertheless.
Yes, well, there's quite a few like that, and they've been bouncing around for reasons of their own over the last few weeks and months. So I think that the next Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party will probably be what's called a Eurosceptic. He will be somebody who is certainly willing to countenance, even in the terms Boris Johnson said, countenance a no-deal Brexit. And they will be pushing this all the time. And the analogy is with nuclear weapons. They call it an arms race in these debates. And it's this, which is that if you have nuclear weapons and you say you're never going to use them, then they're useless. If you have nuclear weapons and you say that you're willing to use them, although it's unthinkable and all the rest of it, then they become a matter of leverage. Then they become a force in diplomacy, in talks and so on. So that's the analogy. If you say we won't have a no-deal Brexit, If you take that off the table, you take the threat away. The Europeans know, that's the argument, that they don't have to concede anything. They don't have to do anything. They can just sit there and watch the British flounder away. If you put it back on the table, which is what Boris Johnson and some of the others are talking about, then the Irish in particular and the other European countries are faced up with the idea of a hard Brexit. Now, what a hard Brexit means in the Irish context is a hard border on Ireland, which is what they wish to avoid, and actually what the British government wishes to avoid, quite sincerely as it happens. But that is what it would mean. And the British government say, well, we're not going to put any controls on the border in Ireland because we don't think there should be one anyway. So it's up to the Europeans, up to the Irish to put controls and customs and all this sort of stuff on the border with Ireland, and they say they don't want to do it. So who is going to do it? So that's the real the threat that the British have got, one of the few threats that they have got, which is that you would impose a hard border on Ireland via the European Union, because the European Union is more keen on protecting the integrity of the single market than the British are. So it would be the European Union putting border guards up in the Irish border, not the British.
Klaus Larres, what's the view on British politics in Europe? What's the view in Germany? I mean, is there a feeling that Boris Johnson or whomever becomes leader in the United Kingdom could get a better deal from Europe?
I don't think that is the view at all. Unfortunately, the British situation has led to a lot of ridicule and joking in Germany in particular, but also in other European countries. Britain is, of course, well known as a serious foreign policy player, has been for an awful long time, and no one can really quite believe it, what is going on in Britain, what has been going on in Britain for the last 2 years. So I think the image of Britain has really plummeted, and it will take an awful lot of effort to get it up to what it once used to be. And I would like to add that Boris Johnson is actually quite unpopular among his colleagues in Parliament. So I don't think that he is necessarily the number one or the one who will end up succeeding Theresa May. If he is in the top two and it's put to the membership of the Conservative Party, then I think he has a serious chance, because the members like him, but his parliamentary colleagues don't like him at all.
Suzanne, I've got to get your view on this, something that Sean O'Grady said, and that is we could have a situation where it will be the European Union that actually sticks up the border.
So it is. It's absolutely true. And I mean, one of the difficulties for Ireland is there's a huge irony that even though the Irish question has become the sticking point, Ireland is the country that most wants Britain to stay and has most to lose. It's got the closest trading relationship than any other country. So on the one hand, it wants to keep Britain as close as possible to have a soft Brexit, but on the other hand, it has become the kind of crucial sticking point in these whole negotiations.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. We are going to leave it there. And before we go, though, another reminder about the Heats podcast. You can listen to some of our great content through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. The podcast covers similar global stories that we do here on the show, but it also includes some personal and candid interviews with our guests and correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just out for a run, please give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search CGTN and you'll see the Heat podcast. Thanks for being with us.